Right. And then when I sat back and said, oh, I got to change this. And then I wrote our authentic life, if you will. And it didn't take long. And I started getting some communication. But it was like, of course, you have to just be your authentic self. And,
Yes.
Just have the confidence to know that, whoever you are, it's got to be the right match.
Your dream is to become a mom. My dream is to help you get there. I'm Rebecca Greenspan, a single mom through domestic adoption and an adoption consultant for over a decade. I'll be your guide, along with other adoption professionals and members of the adoption constellation, walking you step by step down this beautiful and complex path of adopting your baby. When I was going through the adoption process, I had no idea what I was doing, what I needed to know, or more importantly, who to trust. Well, after helping hundreds and hundreds of families grow through the beauty and complexity of adoption, I've learned more than a thing or two, and let me tell you, it's not always rainbows and butterflies. This isn't just another podcast sharing adoption stories, but it's for you if you're genuinely committed to diving in with an open heart, eager to learn everything there is to know about adopting a baby so that you can show up for yourself and your child in the best way possible. This podcast is for you if you're ready to put your newfound knowledge into action. Adoption isn't for the weak of heart, and it certainly isn't done when your baby gets placed in your arms. If that's what you think, I'm afraid you're living in La La Land. My promise to you is to keep it real if you promise to keep digging. We'll acknowledge the hard, and we'll also celebrate the joy that is adoption. You ready? Let's do this. Welcome back to another enlightening episode of the Adoption Roadmap Podcast. I'm your guide, Rebecca Greenspan, and today we're venturing into uncharted territory with a true trailblazer. Joining me is a remarkable pioneer, not once but twice over. Picture this, a woman who has not only shattered glass ceilings in the corporate world, but has also redefined the adoption landscape with her pioneering spirit. Intrigued? You should be. Meet Linda Sexton, a force to be reckoned with, engineer turned adoptive mom, author, speaker, and advocate extraordinaire. Linda's story isn't just about breaking barriers, it's about forging connections and redefining what it means to be a family. From breaking barriers as a woman engineer to nurturing the unbreakable bonds of open adoption, Linda is here to share the beauty and intricacies of establishing lifelong connections. Linda's heartfelt memoir, The Branches We Cherish, an open adoption memoir, is grabbing hearts and awards, promising enlightenment and hope. With her two children now in their 20s, she's not just talking the talk, she's walking the walk, maintaining meaningful connections with all four parents involved. Let's embark on this journey together, right here on the Adoption Roadmap Podcast. I'm so glad to have you here, Linda. Could you share with us about the Open Adoption Bin? That's where I want to start. And tell me what that is and what some of the most significant memories your children have from it.
Okay, well, thank you, Rebecca. I am so delighted to be here today. And thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Absolutely.
How nice was that? So the Open Adoption Bin, I think that's a really interesting place to start.
Mm-hmm.
And the Open Adoption Bin is that place, that box, that big plastic bin, whatever you have that you put all of your memories in. And whether it's pictures or mementos or letters that you got. Now, it's not unlike what parents do. They keep their kids' mementos, but this is very different because as an adoptive parent, and by the way, as a birth parent as well, when you have an opportunity when you get something, you want to take that memory and you put it away because you never know how long is this relationship going to last? Am I going to still be able to see the birth parents and have a connection a year from now, 5 years from now, 20 years from now? So you grab everything that you can and you put these memories in a bin, and they carry so much meaning and emotion to you. So when my youngest Sophie, who's now 25 years old, went to see her birth father. And she does visit her birth father and his family a couple times a year. They have a couple of kids that are now 7 and 9 years old, and she loves seeing these half siblings of hers. But she was visiting with him, and he pulls out the bin, and they sat in the living room and they pulled out things from the bin and they put it all over the floor, if you can imagine. And the kiddos were sitting there with them. And I knew this was happening because Sophie started taking pictures of these pictures and texting them to me. And she was having the best time. But what happened was at some point she got to pictures of her birth mom and birth dad during the pregnancy. Rachel was 15 years old when Sophie was born, and Ricky was 16 years old. And Sophie was looking at pictures of them at the prom as teenagers. And now Sophie at 25, all of a sudden was able to have empathy and imagine what her birth parents were going through. And it became very poignant for her. And it brought up a longing for her to actually get more connected and to get closer to her birth mom. So normally it's the adoptive parents and the birth parents that are feeling all these feels around it. And I just thought it was really interesting, and it took her a while to process these feelings, but that open adoption bin is very important.
That's awesome. So for her, what was in there that was so meaningful for her were the pictures.
It really was the pictures
Yeah.
and just the description of what went on. And I also say that I did, of course, keep my own bins for each of my children. And every
Oh,
time I
okay.
said to them, do you want to go through the bin? Because sometimes I would get letters from birth parents or birth grandparents or little just mementos or gifts. And I kept them all. But do you know, neither of my children, and again, they're 25 and 29 years old now. I say, you want to go through it? Nope, they're not wanting to do that yet. Now they will someday, but I
Yeah.
kind of chalk that up to open adoption because my children grew up knowing their birth families. So they didn't need the bin, so to speak,
Got
yet,
it.
but they will
Yeah.
enjoy having it at some point.
Absolutely. That's really cool. So when you first adopted, how did this concept of open adoption, because I know that's what your book is all about, right?
Yes.
The branches we cherish. How did this concept of open adoption get introduced to you? Because it wasn't very common then, I don't think. So
No,
what
it
was
was
your
not.
understanding of it? And yeah, what did it mean to you then? What does it mean to you now? Like,
30 years ago, when my
yeah.
husband and I decided that we wanted to adopt, we went, of course, to the traditional agencies. We assumed we would have to do a closed adoption because that's just how adoptions were done.
That's how they
So
all
we
were,
went to
yeah.
the traditional agencies and we applied, and we started getting rejections. And we were stunned. Why are we getting these rejections? We were
Yeah.
married. We were professionals. We owned our house. Our background check came out just fine.
Yeah.
And what we were told is that we were unfit to be parents because of our age. I was 36 years old at the time, 3 years old. So we did some more research and we found out that there was this agency in San Antonio, Texas. We lived in Houston, Texas at the time, and they were doing something new called open adoption, which of course we had never heard of. So we took the 3-hour drive from Houston to San Antonio and we learned about it. And we were in awe when we learned that an expecting mom could actually choose the parents to raise her children. And back in that time, they had a book with literally 50 waiting parents. And an expecting mom who was considering adoption would come in and would be given this book. And she could go through the book, decide who she might want to contact with, interview with, and of course, the agency helped you meet with each other.
Yeah.
And then once you were matched, it was up to you and the birth parents to decide how you wanted to define openness. And it could be anything from we're always going to make sure that we share our current addresses all the way through cards and letters, through visitation. But it was completely up to you how to do
Wow.
it. And that was my understanding of open adoption at the time. And basically, it was up to us. And we kind of had to make it up as we went because we really didn't have much information beyond that. I remember what they told us is that open adoption was started, and I think it actually started out on the West Coast,
Yeah.
and that there was more research and understanding about it. And this agency, I think, felt that it was a very good thing.
Yeah.
And, I think they found out that expecting moms, particularly
Mm-hmm.
when they came there, that idea of being able to choose who raises your child and then have the ability to stay in contact, really, I think they got great feedback from the expecting moms. So that's how it went. And it made sense to us. I mean, I will say
Yeah,
that when we learned about it, it was like, wow, this just makes so much sense. And we especially thought for the expecting mom,
for sure.
having an ability to know and see that child
Mm-hmm.
thrive, it was like, why wouldn't you do that?
I want to read a part in your book where I think it's one of the birth fathers. He said, at some point during the pregnancy, we began to consider open adoption. I knew if I were to forego raising her, I could only be at peace if she knew that I loved her and still wanted to be part of her life. Rachel felt the same way, the birth mom. As a result, closed adoption was not an option. I did not want her sitting in her bedroom many years later, wondering why she had blue eyes, blonde hair, braces, flat feet, and a peculiar disposition to saying y'all instead of you guys. I love that. I wasn't sure how open adoption would work, but it began to take shape one day at a TGI Fridays in Houston on the faces of two wonderful people that I had never met before. That was the day I met David and Linda, Sophie's adopted parents. People always talk about those moments in their lives when destiny or fate makes an appearance and they just knew it. Well, prior to that visit, I can't recall any experience where I was absolutely sure of anything. But when Rachel and I met David and Linda for the first time, we just knew it. I mean, I can see it brings
I,
tears to your
I
eyes
know it
just
does
even
still.
reliving that.
Yeah,
So, talk to me about what openness meant to you guys together at the beginning and what it looks like now. How has that changed?
yeah. It's so poignant for me. And I
Mm,
remember so many moments, and that one when we did meet Rachel and Ricky. And I will actually say that at that time, they also were talking to a couple of other couples.
mm,
It's so important that the match feels right.
yeah.
And I know that, we both felt that there was divine intervention here when we had met each other. It wasn't like it was super easy for them or for us, but
Yeah.
they had an affirmation that day. And so did we. But it took us actually a couple more months before an official match was actually made.
Mhm.
And I would say that with this couple, so this was Sophie's birth parents, when the match was made and after Sophie was born, we did have a very intensive first year of visitation with them.
Oh, okay.
And then when Sophie was only one years old, we got transferred from Texas to Virginia. So
Hmm.
what that meant was that for them to come see us, they used to drive to our house, right, and see us. They had to either get on an airplane, or the first time they came to see us, they drove from Texas to Virginia, and it was Ricky's mom that drove the two of them.
Wow, how long of a
And
drive?
I remember them pulling into our driveway just exhausted, after a 24-hour trip.
Oh gosh.
But that was the start. And Ricky probably has seen Sophie every single year that that family made sure. And of course, we worked at it, mutually.
Wow.
for the growing up years, I was, of course, always the intermediary. I was the one talking to the birth parents. We would make, and the birth grandparents, and we would make decisions together and we would plan the trips. Well, today, and I love this part about our open adoption, I'm no longer an intermediary. So they talk to each other freely. They just freely see each other, and they are always texting me about it and talking about it. Sophie texted me just last weekend and said, Ricky's family just reached out to me. They want me for Thanksgiving this year. Mom, is that okay? And I said, of course, as long as I get you for Christmas. So that's the way it is. They're communicating with each other today. And I love that.
That's so beautiful. So it sounds like your kids call them by their first names. Like, what did you used to refer to them as? And what are your, how did the whole calling each
how
other
do you
thing?
call them? Because you hear lots of stories and people, use different names. We've always just called them by their first name. And we talked to the birth parents about it, and they said, that's what we want the kids to call us by as well. Sometimes people say birth mom is like a special aunt. And I used to try to get my head around that, because you might call them aunt or something like that. They're not a special aunt. They are that child's birth mom or that child's birth father. It's a very important and unique and special role. So you can't compare it to anything else. And, you just have to decide together. But that's the key, decide together. And everybody was comfortable with on a first name basis, and it's worked quite well.
Perfect. How do you think your children would define open adoption?
Well, I think certainly their understanding of open adoption has changed, but I actually love the question because I dealt with that in my book. One of the things that I tried so hard to do, Rebecca, is get the voice of everybody in here. So I interviewed all 4 birth parents as well as my children for the book. And I've got all of their voices in here.
Oh, wonderful.
And some of the feedback I get is people love the chapter where I interviewed my children. And I'm going to actually read from that to answer that question.
Perfect.
Because I had asked both Finley and Sophie, what is your current view of open adoption? This is part of Finley's response.
Before we go on, we're going to take a quick break, but don't go away. We still have so much to talk about. The Adoption Roadmap podcast is sponsored by the Adoption Roadmap Academy, the only online program of its kind for hopeful adoptive parents like you who want step-by-step guidance, preparing for your home study, creating a compelling adoption profile book, choosing the right agencies, and more so that you can bring your baby home sooner. As an adoption consultant and adoptive mom who's been where you are, I'm going to guide you step by step through everything you need to know about the domestic infant adoption journey from home study to finalization. And the great part is you get to do it at your own pace with a supportive community behind you. The Adoption Roadmap Academy is a step-by-step guide to domestic infant adoption for hopeful individuals and families who are sick and tired of waiting forever. It's the first and only self-paced adoption consultant-led program that shows you exactly how to navigate the domestic adoption process from home study to finalization. With our proven 4-step adoption roadmap model, you're going to be able to save time you can't make up, hours and weeks and even months of tedious legwork and research are done for you. You're going to be able to go at your own pace. No matter what else is going on in life, nobody's going to be breathing down your throat. You are going to be able to gain and keep momentum because everything is going to be spoon-fed for you in exactly the way you need. You are going to possibly even save money by knowing how to vet situations and working with the right agencies. It could save you a lot of heartache. You are going to be able to access this course anytime, anywhere and get expert guidance and support, not only by me, but also by an amazing community who know exactly what you are walking through. Here's what you can expect inside. You'll be getting streaming videos, worksheets, bonus resources, an adoption profile creation, agency contacts, live streams to connect with other people, and unending education, all using our 4-step proprietary adoption roadmap model. Plus, you'll be receiving a bonus mindset step that I highly recommend for everyone. So if you're interested in starting your adoption journey and ready to fast forward and simplify your domestic adoption process, please email the word academy to support@rgadoptionconsulting.com today, and we'll get you started.
This is part of Finley's response.
Great.
Finley says, quote, "My understanding of open versus traditional adoption is that my birth family was part of my life from the time I was adopted until now. I think that open adoption is good because it has given me a foundation for understanding who I am in relation to my family and my birth family, and accept being adopted. It changes adoption to being more about love than feeling like someone gave you away or abandoned you. From the eyes of a child, it is a lot easier to grasp the concept of being about love when you feel that love from both your adoptive family and your birth family. Even as a child, I understood that it was a good decision. I know adoption is about love no matter what, but open makes it easier for a child to understand this." So that's directly from Finley. That is their understanding. And, Finley will go on to say, and actually Sophie as well, they don't know a lot of other people who are in open arrangements. And Sophie will say, when I meet other people that are adopted, I learn that they don't know their birth parents like I knew my birth parents. And I feel almost guilty that I, have had the opportunity. So their understanding of it as they're growing is that it was a little bit unusual and maybe not the norm. And they're very, very appreciative of the fact that they can know their birth family.
Beautiful. And that, that really speaks to not only just you, but their birth parents as well, who saw that. Tell me about Out of Spoons.
Oh, Out of Spoons. Yeah. So, I have to say, Out of Spoons is a term that we use in our family, and I'll explain it in a minute. But I want to say first that my children, both of them, did need help and therapy as they grew up, particularly in those teen years. So even though they were in an open arrangement, adoption is something that a child really needs to reckon with. And we found that when both of them got to be teenagers, particularly, they did need some help and therapy.
Yeah.
And one of the therapists that Finley was going to as a teenager had suggested this idea of spoons. And the way they described it is you only have so much emotional bandwidth to deal with something. So you may be grieving something or feeling something about it, and you can talk about it for a while. You can just let all those emotions out. But at some point, you're out of spoons, right? You only have so much you can deal with. So when
I'm often out of spoons.
You're out of spoons. So, if I saw that something's bothering my kids and I say, okay, you want to talk about it? They said, Mom, I'm out of spoons. And that was my signal. Just leave it alone. Now's not the time. Maybe you can come back to it later, but I am out of emotional spoons today and leave me alone. So it's just a fun sort of shortcut that we have when my kids look at me and say, out of spoons, Mom, not right now.
I absolutely love that. So I'm curious if anyone listening has a phrase like out of spoons. It reminds me also of I started talking to my son, who is currently 12 and a half,
Mhm.
about if he's out somewhere and, he's not going to parties or anything really yet, maybe some bar mitzvahs here and there, but if he wants to come home or needs me to pick him up, what's that word if he doesn't want to say that in front of his friends?
Oh,
And
right.
so we have our word, which I know is an important thing for teenagers too, to have with their families, like if they're ever in trouble or if they ever need you, like what's the word, or if you're at a party, right, and they're like, I got to get out of here, if you're at a family thing or something,
Yeah.
what is that thing that they can say to you? So that is what it reminds me of. I love it. Let's talk about your book a little bit. The Branches We Cherish, an open adoption memoir. What inspired you to write this book, and what message do you hope readers are going to take from this?
Inspiration for this actually came 30 years ago because I mentioned I was in awe of the process. And I
Hmm.
will say that the the process is hard for any waiting parents. There's no question
Yes.
about it. And we did have the opportunity to actually speak with a number of expecting moms. I know that's kind of unusual, and there are reasons for that. And I do talk a little bit about that in the book, but took really good notes because it was very interesting for me to learn about this and learn about what people thought. And I guess I had that idea in my head that, I probably need to share this one
Hmm.
day. And when I retired, I finally sat down to share it, but I recognized that open adoption, even though it makes so much sense to adoptive parents, is so scary, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a
Mm-hmm.
frightening concept because you think about how awkward is it going to be to raise a child with the birth parents in the picture?
Mm-hmm.
Or you wonder, what does visitation really look like? And, a year, 5 years, 20 years down the road, you also might be worried about how's my child going to react to this, that they've got, a couple of sets of parents, and are they
Yeah.
going to get confused, and are they going to want the birth parents more than they want me? Or if a birth mom comes back and holds her baby and sees her baby, is she going to want that baby back? Right?
All those myths that we
All
have
those
in our
things go through your
heads.
head.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, there's so many hopeful waiting parents out there. I thought I need to share this story. And so that really inspired me. And I wrote my memoir, and lots of ups and downs with getting it out and getting it published. But I will say that I learned so much from writing this memoir and researching and getting feedback that I really didn't expect. So I found out a couple of really important things. One thing is that the birth moms, especially after the visits with us, which were always so much fun and enjoyable, and we loved seeing each other. But after the visits, they would go back home, and it really opened up a lot of wounds and grief and depression,
Mm,
which they didn't share with me at the time. They shared with me
interesting.
when I interviewed them for the book, but they kind of hid their grief from us, if you will. And I
Wow.
learned that my children's birth parents, all four of them, really did need help and support, professional help and support and therapy post placement. And they did
So
not get it.
important.
They did not get it.
So important.
And then the other thing that I learned is that my children, who I thought would have no adoption related issues because we were
Yeah.
so open,
Right.
did have adoption related issues. And
Mm.
then I learned that 1/3 of all children or all adolescents referred to for psychotherapy are in fact adopted. Adopted
Wow.
children often need help and therapy and support. So, what I decided once I got the book out is that 100% of the profits from the Branches We Cherish are going to go to nonprofit organizations that provide support and therapy to birth parents and adopted persons post placement. Because that need is so great and the resources available
Bravo.
don't match the need, right? So that's my way of giving back because I was so fortunate and I just really discovered that those two groups still need a lot of help that in many cases they're not getting.
Wow. Thank you for that. I'm so glad you brought up all of that. First of all, are there any organizations specifically that you want to call out that are doing this?
There's two that are kind of doing great work that I know of. One is called On Your Feet Foundation,
Yeah.
and they support birth parents, and they've got birth mom support groups, and they're actually also doing some birth father support groups.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I will also mention, I talk about this in the book, that Ricky, Sophie's birth father, did reach out to Brave Love, and they did give him some support. They're an organization out of Dallas. And then for adoptive persons, it's hard to find adoption competent therapists and professionals. There's an organization called Boston Post Adoption Resources, and they have about a dozen really competent adoption therapists who really focus on adoptees and hear adoptee voices. And they do a lot of their support and therapy virtually. Boston Post Adoption Resources is the other one that I really will be supporting with this book.
That's fantastic. And we will link all of those places in the show notes for today. We tell every family that we work with that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when they are going to need somebody in their back pocket to call, and that we recommend everybody start working with an adoption competent therapist while they are going through their journey. Because even if they don't think they need one, first of all, they probably do. Yeah. There's probably things that are bubbling up that they can't even put a name on yet. And they will need them as their child starts understanding what this word adoption means, or has questions, or says that one thing that you are dreading the day they say and you don't know how to deal with it. Or, there's so many things. And it is difficult to find an adoption competent therapist. I know for me, one of the things that I really struggled with, because as you mentioned earlier, there are issues that arise for adoptees. A lot of adoptees have ADHD. A lot of adoptees have all sorts of things, right? And I got to a point where it's like, what's more important for me to find a therapist that's a specialist in, right? And it was difficult for me to find one that kind of encompassed all the things I needed. And I think the most important thing is to just start. Yeah. That if you can find an adoption competent therapist and somebody who deals with ADHD and somebody who deals with whatever you're dealing with, wonderful. But it's more important to just start and have that person. I learned long ago, as I've listened over the years to adoptees speak, that the most important person that has helped them through their adoption journey is their therapist. And so I can't stress enough how important that is. And kudos to you, Linda, for having that focus for the proceeds of your book. Thank you. I'm curious, as an ex-corporate gal,
yes,
do you find any parallels between corporate leadership and your advocacy work in open adoption? And if so, what are they?
So the parallel that I find from the corporate world to my book, The Branches We Cherish, really has to do with authenticity. So as I wrote my book, I tried really hard to not only talk about why open adoption is a good and can end up being very joyful and very loving, and you have all these great relationships and you're so happy you did it in the end, but there's a lot of challenges that go with it, right? Open adoption is not for the faint of heart at all. Open adoption, you have to really, really work at, and you're going to have pluses, you're going to have minuses, you're going to have disappointments, you're going to disappoint some people at times. And you just have to be ready for that, and you need to be educated.
Yeah.
So I really try with an authentic voice to talk about the joys and the challenges, right? Adoption is complicated, and it's both, and and
Mm.
it's all of those things together. So I just
Mhm.
think that authenticity is the most important thing, whether you're leading in a corporation or whether you're talking about your open adoption story. So that is the biggest
What
parallel that I've found.
what a great answer.
I have a little story in my book about trying to be something that I thought an expecting mom would
Ah,
want.
oh
Right.
yes,
So
preach, Linda.
when I wrote one of my letters, I was like thinking, okay, now what would this expecting mom want to
Yes.
hear from me? And I wrote the letter that way. And
Mm.
guess what happened?
You didn't get chosen.
Absolutely nothing. I didn't get a call. I didn't
They
get
they
anything.
see
And
right
then,
through it.
right. And then when I sat back and said, oh, I got to change this. And then I wrote our authentic life, if you will. And it didn't take long. And I started getting some communication. But it was like, of course, you have to just be your authentic self and,
Yes,
just have the confidence to know that, whoever you are, it's got to be the right match. So be
absolutely.
authentic. And I learned that lesson through this
Yeah, and
process.
nobody's looking for perfection.
No, they're
In
not.
fact, they're looking for the opposite of perfection. So openness, right? And you said at the very beginning, we had to navigate this on our own. And when you did it, it was fairly new. How is it put into place? Can you tell us something about open adoption agreements, communication agreements? What do you have to say about the agreements that are put into place? What are they? How are they looked after and
Yes.
enforced?
Yes. Okay. That's a really good point about the agreements. And of course, I can speak to what we did, which was years ago.
Yeah.
And I know things have progressed a lot. But the first thing I want to say about an agreement is it cannot be set in stone because you really don't know how you're going to feel.
Mm-hmm.
So for us, the agency sat down with us before the child was born during our match meeting and said, okay, what do you want the next 6 months to look like? And it's almost like the expecting parents and us, we sat there and thought about it. And, it was really about what does the expecting parents, what do they want? And they really didn't know what they wanted. I mean, it's almost
Yeah.
unrealistic to think that they would. But they did their best. And, we did our best to come to an agreement with what we thought those first 6 months would look like. And what we found out in both cases is that what we wrote on that piece of paper is not what happened. So,
Oh, interesting.
yeah, things really changed because after the birth, particularly a birth mom, and again, in our case, and every case is unique, but both of the birth moms felt very differently after the birth than they did before the birth.
Really?
And I
Okay.
know there's a lot of things today. There's some states that really try to enforce these agreements,
Right.
so that,
In air
adoptive
quotes.
yeah, adoptive parents
Enforced.
can't change their mind. And I think all of that, I think what's most important is the promises that you make are the promises you need to keep.
It
So
goes
if
back to
you
being
promise,
authentic. Yeah.
absolutely. And if you promise an open arrangement, you need to keep an open arrangement. Now, how you define exactly what that looks like is what really can change. So in the case of Finley's birth mom, Jenna, she said, I don't think I really want visitation. Please send me pictures at birthday and at Christmas. That's all I
Interesting.
want. I just don't think I can do it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me tell you, we had that baby home, and maybe 3 weeks later, we got a call from Jenna, and Jenna said, I need to see you. I need to see the baby. And what was very interesting, though, is we really wanted to see Jenna. See, we had the privilege
Oh,
of matching with Jenna actually 6 months before the baby was
wow.
born. That's a long match, and I know that
Yes.
doesn't happen too much today. But we got to know Jenna We loved Jenna. We wanted to see her, but we were nervous too, right? And
Sure.
we actually met her at a restaurant with her mom. And of course, what was going through our minds is when she holds the baby, what's she going to do? How's she going to feel? Is she going to say, I made the biggest mistake
Mm-hmm.
of my life? But what really happened at that restaurant that day is that Jenna and her mom came and they brought us the most beautiful gift. It was actually Jenna's baby blanket
Oh
that
my.
that her mom had embroidered Jenna's name and birth date on it, and under it she embroidered Finley's name and birth
Oh,
date, and they gave that to us.
wow.
So what an affirmation of,
Ooh,
I want you to parent this child. Now, that doesn't mean it was easy for Jenna, but that
sure.
was an affirmation. That wasn't, anything other than that. Well, after that first time, we then scheduled the next 3 visits on the
Wow.
calendar. And that's what I would say. Go 1 or 2 or 3 visits at a time. If you're going to do visitation, which I highly recommend if you have the privilege of being able to do it, and if it's safe, do it. But you don't have to say, here's the calendar for the next year or 2 years or 5 years. Here's the calendar for the next month or 2 months or 3 months. Don't give yourself the grace to know how you feel and how the birth mom or the birth family is going to feel will change over time and needs change. So give each other grace to be flexible with that. So that's what I would
Absolutely.
say about open agreements. Keep the spirit of the promise open, but
That's a good
fill
way
in
to
the
put it.
details as you go along.
Yeah, I want to read something from your book in a minute, but so there is agreements, communication agreements written up and both sides sign, and even in states where it's enforceable by law, I say it's in air quotes because it would really take a lot to enforce that.
Yeah.
So it goes back to being authentic and really keeping your promises. But in your book, in chapter 7, you say, finally, October arrived. The baby was due in 1 month, so our counselor facilitated a meeting between Jenna, David, and me to create a cooperative agreement that would outline our expectations for the next 6 months. The agreement was a form with questions, and I hand wrote Jenna's responses. It was not a legal agreement, but the discussion helped tremendously. The meeting was not difficult, and Jenna seemed pretty sure about what she wanted. I do recall that she seemed to be putting some distance between us on this day. Here is the agreement, and I want to read part of this. The following is an informal understanding between Jenna and David and Linda related to the birth, placement, and post-placement relationships between these two parties. This is not set forth as legally binding agreement. Rather, it's used as an instrument to guide and facilitate continued open communication between the parties involved, which you just talked about. It's expected that feelings may change after the baby is born. I don't know if all agreements say these things now. I wish they did because it's so true. This agreement should be revised as needed. A willingness of both parties to understand and work with needed changes to this agreement is understood. And then it went on to say plan for contact, and how often. You even went so far as plan for contact from October 6th until the labor begins, plan for contact when labor begins. I think most agreements are for after the birth, but how often you're going to contact each other, how, if you're going to visit together. Yours actually also talked about circumcision, baby naming, discharge from hospital, all of that, which is usually put into a separate piece of paper now,
Okay.
which is called the birth plan.
Yeah.
So there's the birth plan and then the communication agreement. But it's just that, like how often. Yours says Jenna will make the first contact, send pictures every Christmas, even if Jenna has not contacted us, includes letters, updates, but no video unless Jenna specifically requests. So it can get pretty specific,
Yeah.
based on what's important to both of you at the time.
Right.
But the importance is that flexibility and keeping your word. Don't ever put something in writing if you don't plan to keep your word.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is so, so very important. And, when I look back at that agreement, of course, we never sat and updated anything in writing. That was the
Sure.
only time we had something in writing. And, it just sort of prompted me that Jenna needed to make the first call, because she did say, look, I'll call you, don't call me. And we were very anxious to hear from Jenna because we really cared about her and we wanted to know how she was doing, but we knew, we couldn't. But boy, she did call us. And
Yeah.
and that started it from there. But
Yeah,
those
it's about being
agreements,
fluid.
I have to say that 30 years ago, I think the Methodist Mission Home did a pretty darn good job of helping us in those stages of
Yeah.
particularly the matching and before birth. I would say that sort of post-placement support to the birth parents, not so much, but
Yeah.
certainly having us try to understand things they did a good job.
Well, speaking of that post placement, do you see any significant changes that you have witnessed over the years in the landscape of open adoption, in the landscape of support? What have you seen, or any trends that
Yeah.
you've seen in adoption?
Certainly a lot has changed. I mean, the first thing is that, again, when I went to write and research the book, I did find out that open adoption is the norm today.
Yes.
That, closed is not, and, maybe semi-open. And it is, again, between the parties. What are they most comfortable with?
Mhm.
So openness, which I think when adoption is the right answer for the expecting parents and when it is necessary, I think openness is just so important. So
Yeah.
that change, I think, is really good. Another trend that I'm seeing is quite an emphasis on ethical adoptions, because there has been in the past a lot of unethical behavior. And I know that some of it does still exist today, unfortunately. However, there are many more resources to be able to determine if an agency that you're dealing with or whoever you're dealing with is in fact ethical, so that adoptive parents now have education where we did not have education at the time. So education is required, and that is such a good thing.
Yes.
And so an adoptive parent knows the kind of questions to ask an agency, like, what kind of support do you give birth parents post-placement? Because you want your birth parent to have therapy, and you want them to have the support they need, because they're going to be able to be a better birth parent, if you will, to that child, right? So education has changed, and I think that that's really important.
Yeah.
The other thing that has changed is there are more adoption competent therapists available today.
Thank goodness.
But there are not nearly enough. And I will say, even though I knew my children needed help and therapy for things like ADHD, by the way, I never considered that adoption was one of the reasons that they needed therapy. That might sound kind of crazy now that I know what I know, but as I was raising them, it didn't occur to me to even try to find an adoption competent therapist. And oh, by the way, if I tried to find one, I probably couldn't anyway. I talked to the therapist and said, my children are adopted, but they just, it's almost like it went over their head.
Yeah, they don't think that that's any reason why they would
didn't
need
think
a therapist
it was
either.
any reason.
Yeah.
So while they were in high school, their therapist didn't. Now, there was a therapist when Finley was in college and that was the first adoption competent therapist that they had.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring this up, because there's a lot of people, especially when you don't adopt transracially, or when it's not as noticeable, right, that your child looks different. People think, oh, well, I adopted at birth, my child's white, they look like us, they'll be fine, and then they check out.
Right.
And it is so far from the truth. So I'm glad that you brought that up. And so what advice would you offer to individuals or couples who are considering open adoption?
If there's one piece of advice, it's this, that always keep the child as the North Star in the relationship. So the
Amen.
relationship between you and the birth parents is really important, but always, 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 that adopted child is the North Star and what is best for that adopted child. If I only had one message to give, that is that an adopted child can benefit greatly by knowing and connecting with members of their birth family when it's safe and possible. And it doesn't have to be a birth mom or a birth dad. If that's not possible, and I know sometimes it isn't, if you can find anyone in their birth family, whether it be a grandmother, a grandfather, an aunt, an uncle, a sibling, any connection for that child can really help them grow up whole. Because, we're all part of nature and nurture. And the adoptive family does all the nurturing and all the loving, and you can get all that stuff right. But there's this huge part of you that's your DNA, that's your nature, that comes from your biological family. So if there's any way that you can give that connection, it can help that child grow up whole. So you do it first and foremost for the child. But then what happens is you develop these relationships and you get this enduring, wonderful love back, but you do it for the child first. So that to me is the most important thing.
I love that. Thank you so much. There's a couple questions that I like to ask everybody. Number one, is there a person or an organization that has really made an impact to your adoption journey? I would love to shout them out if there's somebody that comes to mind.
When I started really working on the book and I reached out to people that were in the adoption space and were adoption competent, etc., I got some really wonderful feedback. And I'll tell you, the person that helped me greatly was Lori Holden. And, she is part of that new book, Adoption Unfiltered, but she also does a podcast and has a wonderful website. And Lori Holden really helped me understand things about birth parents and adoptees that I had not really quite appreciated. And in fact, she was an influence on some of the things that I did say in my book as well.
Great. Thank you for that. And now a couple rapid fire questions. Is there a book or podcast that you're listening to right now that you love? And it doesn't have to be adoption related.
I do listen to Lori Holden's podcast. I try to listen to a lot of adoption podcasts because that helps me a great deal.
Who is your hero? Yes.
My mom.
Why?
Yeah. Well, my mom was a single mom and raised 4 girls by herself. And I didn't appreciate it, how hard that was then. But after I grew up and I had 2 children of my own, and I have a partner, a husband that helped me with it, and how hard it was raising 2 with 2 of us, I sit back and think, Mom, how did you do it? So my mom's my hero.
Biggest lesson you've learned in life, or one of the biggest lessons you've learned?
Biggest lesson I learned is your thoughts are so important, and you move towards and become that which you think about. If you think about things and if you can imagine and visualize your future or the way you want things to be, you'll move towards that and you'll become that. And your thoughts are just so important.
Linda Sexton, thank you so much. To get her book, The Branches We Cherish, an open adoption memoir, we will link that in the show notes. You can find it on Amazon. If you're curious to dive deeper, leave us a comment, send us a direct message, or simply hit that like button. Your story, questions, and journey matter to us. Thank you so much for tuning in. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode of the Adoption Roadmap podcast. If you did, I have a few favors to ask of you. First, Please hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And while you're at it, I'd love to hear your takeaways. Please write a review and let me know what you liked. And if you have a question or a suggestion on what you'd like to hear, I'd love to hear that too. Please shoot me an email at support@rgadoptionconsulting.com and let me know what you'd like to hear about. And if you have a question, I may just answer it online. Thanks again for listening. Tune in every Wednesday and Friday morning for a brand new episode of the Adoption Roadmap podcast. Until next time, bye-bye.